Alan Wake's eponymous and titular protagonist is a thriller novelist suffering writer's block. Alan Wake's narrative structure is episodic and plays as though it is a mini-series on television, featuring previously on segments in the beginning of each episode chapter. But where many overtly episodic or cinematic games lean toward an interactive narrative genre, where action-oriented QTEs and indeterminate speech options compose the title's gameplay, Alan Wake is marketed as a psychological third-person action game. Gameplay is engaging throughout each episode, implementing unique light mechanics that are thoughtful and considered. Further, Alan Wake proficiently meshes its paranormal television series-esque narrative structure and its unique mechanical gimmicks as an action game. Alan equips a regular flashlight that may later be traded in for a heavy-duty flashlight and a heavy-duty lantern. The flashlight's beam interestingly behaves as a reticle and is paramount in both combat and exploration. Enemies dubbed the Taken mutely overwhelm and rush the player in windswept fog, which becomes more dense the further players wander into the woods. The Taken are defeated through first aiming the flashlight beam reticle upon an enemy or keeping another light source near an enemy long enough to deplete a shrinking circle gauge, and consequently light burn them, banishing the darkness and leaving a vulnerable physical enemy. Once light burned, Alan can shoot them with an equipped firearm. Alan equips a revolver, a shotgun that can be traded in for a pump-action shotgun, and a hunting rifle, but only one long gun type can be equipped, meaning players may trade a shotgun for a hunting rifle if they choose. Alan's other offensive and defensive resources are a flare gun, individual flares, and flashbang grenades. Flare gun rounds and individual flares are powerful and ignite an AoE cloud of blood-red light, causing encroaching enemies to back away. Individual flares can either be held and maneuvered with to advance while keeping enemies at a distance, or placed on the ground after igniting so that players can perform other actions with a brief defense threshold. Flashbangs, however, are overpowered and almost always execute enemies in a single hit, defeating enemies whether or not they have already been light burned. If the flashlight's loaded battery did not recharge on its own when not being aimed, scrounging for lithium batteries would be more suspenseful and amplify the game's survival horror. Alan Wake features bosses which are only marginal in difference from the regular enemies, being much quicker and racing through the area in a blur, but also laughably regurgitate absurd dialogue inherent to the character, such as gas station owner Carl Stuckey's mechanic facts or park ranger Rusty's Elderwood National Park facts. The Taken are ludicrously quick, hurl arcing projectiles, and appear in great numbers. Stamina is respectively poor but designed appropriately because it amplifies tension and negates purely evasive strategies. For example, players cannot merely sprint through wooded mists to evade enemies and may be swarmed as a result when stamina is depleted. The game's sprinting mechanic begins its animation in a lagged dodge, where if players time the dodge accurately as an enemy strikes or as a projectile is hurtling toward them, a slow motion effect ensues. Reserving stamina for impromptu evasions and momentum bursts may be advantageous if players have correct timing. An unkindness of dark-infested ravens nosedive into the player from any angle and can be staved off with light. Inanimate objects are then later introduced as enemies who convulse before annoyingly flinging themselves toward the player, but if the enemy is not a humanoid figure, then players are only demanded to light burn them in order to defeat them. Convulsing tar blots also appear but are often avoidable. Alan Wake's in-game camera has a remarkably wide draw distance and FOV, which may be difficult adjusting to in the beginning because of its unleashed tether, but is ultimately helpful when having to detect enemies around the player. Furthermore, resources and ammunition are provided in bountiful measure, but can deplete quickly if exhausted nonchalantly, and so constant momentum through the woods is advised. Therefore, when fog appears, enemies begin pursuing players in tense races between ephemeral, incandescent safe havens. Safe havens are either positioned already as lampposts and spotlights, or produced in the middle of the dark using generators, which take time and a number of inputs to activate. But beneath each cylindrical column of light is a checkpoint and a rush of health restoration, where any enemies pursuing the player despawn momentarily until players step out from the light again. Alan Wake impressively seizes certain mechanics throughout the game, making the game's action-oriented mechanics and gimmicks unique, instead of having the game feel as though it is a third-person shooter. Players often begin an episode or level with nothing equipped, and the same materials and resources are then doled out. Players may only have a flashlight equipped, for example, in sequences where Alan must light burn and fend off enemies with flares in order for the kidnapper to fire upon them in Lover's Peak. Otherwise, NPCs who aid in combat are far and few between, such as in a sequence when a helicopter burns enemies and players must then shoot them when vulnerable. Such sequences are effective because players then cannot become too comfortable or dependent upon a certain firearm or resource, since it is likely to be restricted from them when other entertaining strategies are demanded, and when players are later reacquainted with Barry Wheeler and Sheriff Sarah Breaker, relief is granted. If players aim the flashlight around and along surfaces, certain areas and resources may be awarded. Cynthia Weaver's light-sensitive spray paint graffiti and navigational aids, which are only perceivable when shining the flashlight's beam upon them, guide players to marked supply caches. Caches commonly supply batteries, flares, or other such resources, plus sometimes a firearm which is not otherwise found until later in the level. Bright Falls is a surprisingly sizable mini-open world in each sequestered area, where players can search humbly for the blue Oh Dear Diner coffee thermoses and readable manuscript pages. Manuscript pages foreshadow events happening in the game and often do not appear in sequence. If pages revealed alternative means in defeating a boss or navigating an area, pages would gift immeasurable value in the game. Rather, Alan Wake's collectibles are pleasant to search for and obtain. Players may tune into television sets featuring brief episodes of Night Springs, a paranatural program homaging the Twilight Zone and using Remedy's now signature live-action footage, comparable to how Alan is shown on a talk show segment in his apartment. Intermittent television sets also showcase Alan's efforts at Bird Leg Cabin, drafting manuscript pages at the behest of Barbara Jagger, the Dark Presence's vessel and a demonic substantive editor, whose influence has also affected Thomas Zane. Alan's wife Alice is insufferable in her panicked and shrieking nyctophobia, which may have been more interestingly associated to Alan and the player's experiences through the dark in the game. Driving sequences punctuate the scope of Remedy's environments, but camera controls and driving controls are ungainly, and it is notable that Alan is able to open and drive any abandoned vehicle without needing keys. Bright Falls is gorgeous in Diver's Isle and its cliffside environmental backgrounds, but Alan Wake's interior designs, textures, and assets are an awful, repetitive blemish on the game, let alone giant QR codes stamped onto surfaces. The game's graphical and textural exercise slogs its otherwise decent environmental storytelling. Alan Wake's final episode is padded as players battle the same ambushes, swarms, and bosses fought in previous episodes, and results in an obscure, open-ended conclusion. If any game is deserving and in need of a next-generation update, let alone an explicit or spiritual sequel, it is Alan Wake.